Great. Thank you all for having me. It's been great set of speakers today, and I think it's quite interesting that I'm scheduled as the last one. Probably it's a good way to wrap things up. Um, I think you guys have all heard a lot of different, very different approaches and perspectives on generative AI. Um, my perspective that I'll talk about is probably a little bit different from, I think, everyone else here. So in particular, I've been a faculty member since I think 2004, so it's been 21 years. And much of it has been spent working on security and privacy issues. For, I don't know, gosh, close to 10 years, I think I was working in ways to protect AI systems from adversarial attacks and building defenses and so on. But in the last few years, really my work has sort of taken a different turn. So I'll get into it. Let's start. There's been obviously a lot of excitement about what generative AI can do. Lots of different interesting applications. Despite the fact that there's some limitations today, a lot of different ways and new ideas about what you can do with generative AI. But with any sort of technology, right? And we've seen this in the past. With any technology, there's always misuse and abuse. Sort of the other side of the coin. And for generative I would say that it's a little bit different from some of the prior technologies, whether it's internet or social media, in the sense that some of the harms are more dramatic, but also the impact, some of the negative impacts of generative AI go far beyond the actual users of generative AI. They impact users that have no interest or are not benefiting from generative AI, which is quite a bit different from most technology shifts that we have had in the past. So my point here that I want to talk about today is that it's really important to consider the possible misuses of new technology that we develop. In particular, I think that, as researchers and as companies and so on, we are really ultimately responsible for the outcomes of the technology that we create. And so that accountability, that responsibility falls on people like us. For example, in the context of AI agents and generative AI agents, there are some potential downsides to allowing AI agents significant autonomy on the internet with our credentials, and we have to really focus on how to try to address some of these issues before deploying large-scale systems. So, much of my work in the last few years has really focused on image models. So I'll sort of start there. In terms of just generic harms, I think we don't have to look very hard to find downsides of generative AI. So whether it's AI slop taking over the internet, flooding, publishers and news articles and the internet in general, or it's people's, faces, voices being taken without their consent, being models sucked into models and then used, like a skin. But it gets worse. Things like models that produce non-consensual adult images of children, sometimes kids in schools and so on, using chatbots and LMs to basically commit criminal acts. Mimicking the images and voices of loved ones, for example, to extract money from the elderly. Lots of these things are happening in real time. And some of the worst things that you can imagine, building deep fakes of models that personalize image models based on celebrities or popular people that we all know and recognize, actresses and so on. And occasionally you'll find a guy in there, but generally speaking, they target women and young women. In this case, this was a lightweight Laura that was targeting specifically all members of the U.S. Congress. In other words, the legislative, the government body that that makes laws in the U.S. So there was a deep fake model on basically producing images of each one of those government making bodies, and of course, young women, as is the case. So these harms are actually here today, and this is very different from sort of security work that I've done in the past, where you talk about sort of imaginary risks and potential problems that may come. Unfortunately, these harms are literally real and in front of us. and happening in real time. So oftentimes this is not something that people talk about, but this has been the focus of my lab since basically the arrival of really popular generative AI, roughly speaking, mid to early 2022. So today I want to very briefly talk about, not a lot of time, so I'll talk about some of our key protected projects that try to protect human creatives from generative AI, and I'll talk about some of the open challenges and open projects that we're working on. So, I think one of the challenges with understanding harms of technology is that we oftentimes think of them as abstract things, right? So, what I want to do is I want to start talking about a very concrete individual person. This is just one example that I know, and I can name many, many other examples. But this particular person is an artist named Kelly McKernan. Kelly, I've known for several years now. She's a friend, and she actually agreed to let me use many of her images from her past. But she is, a prototypical sort of independent artist in the U.S. Okay, so we have images of Kelly when she's growing up as a kid, even very, very young, chalk on a sidewalk, drawing and sort of learning very basic artistic skills, but already showing talent. Young Kelly getting into galleries and really maturing in terms of the type of art she's able to create, and then eventually becoming a professional independent artist, um, having created an entire style that is uniquely hers. She becomes known for it, and she's able to actually support her family fairly well. So just very briefly, in the US at least, something like more than 50% of all visual artists are self-employed. I think this actually is a understatement. I think the real number is somewhere around 85% if you take away things like sculptors and gallery curators and so on. Um, they don't get paid a lot. The majority of artists earn barely minimum wage or the poverty line in the US. So they're typically very barely holding on and paying rent and mortgages, but mostly because they love what they do. So they don't want to sort of switch careers and do something different, right? So this is Kelly's website. You can see some of her art. This is, even more sort of successful, quote unquote, commercial artists like Carla Ortiz, another friend of mine who's done a lot of work for Disney, Doctor Strange, Black Panther, Guardians of the Galaxy, all these movies. She still does not make the kind of money that we imagine professional artists would actually make. So, having a lifestyle like this, one day, Kelly wakes up and one of her friends tells her that her work on the internet has been scraped into a model, into the first generative AI model as part of Layout 5B. Okay. So what does that mean? That means that very quickly, Kelly learns that you can go on some of these models and basically use her name like a prompt. You can create images that mimic her style, mimic her art, um, simply by using her name as a prompt. Right. So these models are ultimately mimicry machines. So they're very good at taking input and generating things that look similar to it. So the actual large image on the right is Kelly's actual art, and all the other images are basically copies. Similarly, you can see, this type of mimicry actually works quite well across different images. There are lots of images here that basically, you can't really tell which ones are real and which ones are mimicries. So there are now industries, there are now platforms where basically tens of thousands of people host these type of models that target individual creators, individual artists. They take art from a particular person. They say, I really like this person's art, but I don't want to pay them to buy their art. So what I'll do is I'll take their art, I'll produce a lightweight model that basically mimics their art, and then that way I will distribute that art, and all of us can enjoy their work for free. Of course, what the actual side effect of this is that the artist who you target basically loses their job and livelihood and ability to make a living. So, impact on real human artists. These are people that I've gotten to know. These are really famous, artists worldwide. Greg Rutowski is in Poland. He is one of the most famous sort of fantasy artists. But he is also the most famous artist known for being used in generative AI. His name is regularly used hundreds of thousands of times as Midjourney prompts to generate images that copy his art. This is Jean Baptiste. He is a artist in France, and he has sold lots of his art, done work for Disney, etc. But now he sees mimicries of his art sold online with his name, and then also submitted to Adobe stock images. Basically, people making money uh, by producing art that tries to be his, but with, of course, they're fakes with his names attached. Okay, and there are lots of this. These are just two single examples, but many more artists who are basically losing their livelihoods because you see other people who are selling tons of pretty images, AI generated images as art, but they're producing this art, quote unquote, at 30x the speed that it would take a normal human. Okay, and lightweight LoRa models are basically not only being used to generate revenue for those who use it and take away from artists, but they're also used as weapons online to threaten and bully artists. So if you don't like a particular artist, you can tell them that you better shut up, or otherwise I'm going to take my LoRa and train you into a model. So lots of disruptions. You can go online and you can sort of see there's tons of social media posts about different types of artists who are suffering from this sort of impact. Many of them are leaving the industry altogether. Many of them are under severe mental stress and depressed and so on and so forth. And then there are other downstream effects, like art schools in the U.S. are closing at a ridiculous rate. Just in a span of about 3 months, in the summer of 2024, several art schools, art colleges that have been around for more than 100 years have closed, all within a span of 3 months, mostly because their enrollment is dropping. Young people no longer want to go into art because they see their heroes and mentors lose their entire livelihoods overnight to an AI model. So they drop out. And when they drop out, these art colleges sort of fall apart and end up closing their doors. So even the ones that don't close their doors are oftentimes closing entire departments because they have to somehow survive and try to make the finances work. Okay, and it's not just art colleges; it's art galleries. It's other types of sort of businesses that have to do with art. They're all sort of suffering downstream consequences of this generative AI effect. So let me talk briefly about what mimicry does, and I'll talk about exactly how we deal with it. Mimicry, you can think of the inside of a diffusion model as sort of a high-dimensional space. But once it learns a bunch of images, it will say, for example, define a certain area as Picasso. It will define a certain area as Jackson Pollock, and then be able to generate something that if I want a painting about Picasso, it'll generate something like that. Now, if you train it on something like, Carla Ortiz, then basically you're going to be able to generate something that looks like Carla. Okay. So what we did was we developed a tool called Glaze that basically disrupts AI using AI. We target AI models and say, well, we understand how these AI models work. We are going to confuse them by slightly modifying the images in very subtle ways so that the images don't look like they're there where Carla really should be, but in fact shifted away into the feature space. So now what that means is that when you ask for a piece of painting from Carla, you get something that looks like a Jackson Pollock, an abstract painting. Okay. So the math, I'm not obviously going to go into that, but it's, fairly straightforward multi-constraint optimization. Okay. So here are some examples, and one of them is the original, and the other one is the Glaze version. And so as you can see, the two versions are actually quite similar. We've had artists complain to us that, in fact, it's actually quite difficult to tell the Glaze versions from the original. So we have to be very careful about naming files and output so that the artists can tell which one is the original, which one is the output, so they can, act accordingly. More sample images. This left columns are the original art from Monet, Van Gogh. Nathan Folks is another artist friend. The middle two columns are mimicries of their art. As you can see, they're fairly similar, not quite similar, not quite good, but similar enough. And then once they've been protected, you can see that the mimicries generally fail and fail badly, and they give you very different artistic styles. So since Glaze was released in 2023, about 2.5 years ago, it's been downloaded close to somewhere around 8.5 to 9 million downloads across 160 countries. It's been sort of adopted by numerous artist associations and groups across the world, South America, Asia, North Africa, EU, lots of awards here and there. And we've been able to sort of speak to lots of different organizations and even help craft legislation and laws about how to regulate and build transparency and accountability into AI. But turns out mimicry is not limited, of course, to individual artists, right? So if you look at companies like Nintendo, um, you have characters that everyone recognizes, but you can also see how Nintendo characters, for example, can be taken, they can be trained on, they can be generated, and now you can basically do things like build entire worlds that look like Nintendo characters, but it's actually a different company. So as it turns out, Nintendo recently has actually gone ahead and sued Pocket Pair, one of the companies that has been mimicking Nintendo's intellectual property with generative AI models. And of course, there are other lawsuits as well. Disney and Universal most recently sued an AI firm, Midjourney, for copyright infringement. And in fact, I think just a couple of weeks ago, Warner Brothers, another major movie studio in the US, filed another lawsuit against the generative AI company, also Midjourney. So here, what we actually can offer is something called Nightshade. Nightshade does what Glaze does, except instead of changing artistic style, we can actually change the composition, right? So you take the original photo of a dog, we can add a very barely susceptible sort of scene visible small pixel set of changes. The modified version is very similar to the original, but to an AI model that we target, it actually learns that this dog has these visual features, right? It actually looks like a cat. Now, what this does is that once you do enough of this, we can make these sort of attacks, if you will, much more convincing than the originals, so that once you trained on some of these images, the model starts to get very confused about what these things are. So, for example, you start with this is SDXL, one of the big diffusion models, and you start with these clean images: dog, car, handbag. And I want to make them cat, cow, toaster, cake, and so on. So once we start adding more and more of these samples through fine tuning or actually injection into the pipeline, you'll see that these models will actually become very, very confused about what car actually means. Maybe car means something like this, and dog means something like this. Okay. So again, Nightshade is a tool that we release for free for artists to use and also companies, because the idea is, this is not something that is a weapon. This is something that's more like a defense. Artists and companies who want to protect their images can apply this to their own images, and as long as they're not being trained on, it's fine. But if they are being trained on without permission, without consent, then these altered changes will have an effect on the models. Okay, so I want to very quickly talk a little bit more about other types of projects that we have going on. So first of all, I think a lot of people have seen what we're doing with Glaze and Nightshade and other similar kind of systems. There are now a growing number of research projects that do Glaze-like things, except to protect human voices or music. And there are other ongoing projects that I'm aware of from a number of different universities. But we're also looking at sort of, other issues in the space, right? Generative AI models are going to be around. And when you're training models, when you're fine-tuning models, the fine-tuning process actually makes it quite easy for someone to take an existing model and perhaps basically, act as if it's theirs, right? Because I've sort of modified this model. I can give you a model. You can't tell where I got my model from. So this makes it actually quite challenging. This idea of a company comes around, says, look, I have this model and it's mine and it's great and it's trained ethically from scratch and you can't prove otherwise. So whether you're a regulator, whether you are the owner of a model that they trained on, you would like to understand where this model came from. So this idea of model provenance is something that we're working on right now, which is given a model, given some set of base models, right? So here are some base models. You have a particular model. You'd like to know where this model came from. is it actually trained from scratch? Did it come from one of the existing models? If so, which model did it actually come from? Right. So we're using statistical methods. We're using diffusion feature analysis to actually understand, basically generate fingerprints of models in such a way that we can actually identify, statistically speaking, where a model came from. Was it trained from scratch, or was it actually a modified version of something that was already there? We're also working on other things. Actually, a couple of projects that we're actually collaborating with Samsung Research on. We're building tools that disrupt abuses use of generative AI. So I'm sure you guys, like most of us, have heard about undressing apps that basically overlay images or modify images of people with versions of themselves, perhaps without clothing. But also, deep fakes models that target individual people using their photographs. So we're working to basically develop and understand how we can build tools that protect human photos in a way that disrupts these types of abusive applications of Gen AI. And then finally, we're working on LMs now, trying to understand how to prevent LMs from leaking private data. LMs obviously train on a large variety of content. They will train on anything and everything, including user input. And oftentimes, when you're interacting with LMs, you can feed it content that might contain private information, for example, phone numbers, addresses, loved ones' names, and all sorts of details. So, how do we actually protect ourselves from LMs that might regurgitate content? How do we make sure that this type of data, sensitive data, does not get repeated by an LM to a different user, or to a data record, or to an AI agent somewhere? So there are lots of sort of broader applications beyond personal privacy, but this is something that we're actually actively working on. Okay. Um, I realize I might have been talking a little bit fast, but that's my talk. So I'm happy to pause and take any questions.